The students of Professor Zyltar's intergalactic engineering class stood in a semicircle, their eyes, some with slit pupils, others glowing with an unnatural light, fixed on the towering figure before them. The professor, a renowned scientist from the Valian race, had been teaching at the Galactic University for over 2 centuries. His thin, elongated limbs moved with mechanical precision as he activated the holographic display in the center of the classroom. The image flickered for a moment before stabilizing into a live projection of Varus 7, a planet known for its rich biodiversity and vast bodies of water, most of which were now suffering from severe pollution due to reckless industrialization. He turned to face the class, his multifaceted eyes sweeping over each student. "This will be your final examination," he announced, his voice reverberating through the room like a sequence of harmonic vibrations. "Your objective is simple. Design and implement a functional water filtration system to purify the polluted lake near the Andorra Research Facility. You have exactly 1 week to complete the task. Your results will determine your standing in this class, and, for some of you, your eligibility for graduation." The students, representing a variety of advanced alien civilizations, exchanged confident glances. Many of them belonged to species that had mastered molecular restructuring, gravity-based filtration, or advanced nanopurification systems. They had spent their entire academic lives immersed in technology far beyond what most sentient beings could comprehend. Among them, Andy Carter, the only human in the class, stood silently at the back, arms crossed as he studied the holographic projection of the contaminated lake. The professor continued, his thin fingers gesturing toward the image. "The water is contaminated with industrial waste, chemical runoff, and biological pathogens. You will need to account for all variables, temperature fluctuations, bacterial mutations, and mineral imbalances. The solution must be self-sustaining, energy-efficient, and capable of long-term application." A tall student from the Drathari species, his blue-scaled skin reflecting the light from the hologram, raised a hand. "Professor, are we allowed to use external energy sources?" "You may," Zyltar responded, "but your efficiency will be factored into the assessment. Over-reliance on high-energy input is a sign of poor engineering." Several students began whispering among themselves, already formulating their designs. Some planned to utilize nanofiltration systems capable of breaking down molecular bonds. Others considered deploying microgravity chambers to separate pure water from pollutants. The challenge was daunting, but for the brightest minds of the Galactic University, it was nothing more than an intellectual exercise. Andy remained quiet, his mind already moving through possibilities. He had grown up on Earth, where water purification had been a necessity for centuries. Unlike many of his classmates, who relied on sophisticated alien technology, he understood that sometimes the best solutions were the simplest ones. While the others focused on designing complex mechanisms, he considered a more fundamental approach. The professor's eyes locked on to him. "Mr. Carter, do you have a question?" Andy shook his head. "No, Professor, I just want to confirm any method that achieves the goal is valid, correct?" "Correct," Zyltar replied, tilting his head slightly. "But I would caution against primitive solutions. Simplicity does not always equate to efficiency." Andy smirked, but said nothing. He had no intention of explaining his plan to the class just yet. The professor clapped his hands together, signaling the start of the exam. "You are dismissed. You may begin your research immediately. Resources are available in the laboratory, and you will have access to the university's fabrication units. I expect significant progress by the end of the first cycle." The students filed out of the classroom, their minds racing with ideas. Andy walked with measured steps, listening as the others discussed their strategies. A group of Zarkonian students, whose crystalline bodies shimmered under the artificial light, debated the efficiency of atomic-level filtration. Another pair from the Tyrexian species, beings whose neural networks operated at near quantum speeds, calculated the probability of success for various purification methods in real time. None of them considered the possibility that the simplest, most natural solution might be the best one. Andy entered the research lab and activated his personal workstation. A holographic interface flickered to life, displaying a breakdown of the contaminants present in the lake. Heavy metals, synthetic toxins, organic decay, everything he expected. But one element stood out. A form of alien bacteria had begun rapidly evolving in the polluted waters, adapting to consume and break down certain toxins. His eyes narrowed as an idea took shape in his mind. If he could modify and accelerate the bacteria's natural filtration process, he wouldn't just clean the lake, he could create a self-sustaining ecosystem capable of purifying entire bodies of water without external interference. He glanced at the others. They were still immersed in their calculations, focused on building the most advanced technology possible. And he grinned. He had always loved an underdog story. And this time, he was going to prove that human ingenuity could outmatch even the most advanced civilizations in the universe. Andy leaned over his workstation, his fingers gliding across the holographic interface as he fine-tuned his research. His eyes flicked over the molecular breakdown of the alien bacteria he had discovered in the polluted lake. It was an anomaly, something that should not have existed under such toxic conditions, yet it thrived. The more he examined it, the more he saw potential. If he could manipulate its genetic structure, he could turn it into a natural purification system, rather than relying on complex filtration devices like his classmates. He exhaled, glancing at the students around him. The Drathari, the Tyrexians, and the Zarkonians were still focused on designing their high-tech solutions, running thousands of simulations to perfect their theoretical models. No one else was paying attention to what was already present in the water. Andy wasn't surprised. Many of the alien species in the class had evolved in civilizations that relied on technological superiority, often dismissing anything that didn't involve high-energy manipulation. That was their weakness. He turned his attention back to the display, isolating a sample of the bacteria. The microscopic organisms were already breaking down the chemical compounds in the water, but at an incredibly slow rate. That was the problem. The lake would take centuries to cleanse itself naturally, which was far beyond the scope of the challenge. He needed a way to accelerate the process without compromising the bacteria's stability. His fingers moved swiftly, accessing the university's genetic sequencing software. He began running modifications, adjusting metabolic pathways and enhancing enzymatic efficiency. If he could make the bacteria multiply faster and process pollutants at an exponential rate, he could create a living filtration system that didn't require external power sources. A voice interrupted his concentration. "You're working with biological agents?" The question came from one of the Zarkonian students, a crystalline entity named Vayrix. His translucent form shimmered under the artificial lighting as he peered at Andy's screen. "That's an unconventional choice." Andy didn't bother looking up. "It's the most efficient one." Vayrix clicked his fingers together, a sound similar to glass striking metal. "Biological systems are unreliable. They mutate, degrade, and become uncontrollable variables. A proper filtration device is predictable." Andy smirked. "That's what makes this better. It adapts. It fixes itself." Vayrix narrowed his glowing violet eyes. "If it fails, you'll have nothing to fall back on." Andy finally turned to face him. "If your tech fails, what's your backup plan?" The Zarkonian hesitated. That was the problem with high-tech solutions. They were rigid. If a nanofiltration unit malfunctioned, it needed repairs. If a gravity purifier overloaded, it became useless. But a biological system? It could evolve. It could persist, even if left unattended. Vayrix exhaled, his crystalline structure humming softly as he walked away, shaking his head. Andy smirked and turned back to his work. He wasn't here to convince anyone. He was here to win. He continued modifying the bacteria, carefully balancing its growth rate to prevent uncontrollable expansion. If he pushed it too far, it could turn into an invasive species, consuming more than just pollutants. He needed it to be aggressive but controlled, capable of neutralizing toxins without disrupting the natural ecosystem. An hour passed. Then 2. His focus was absolute, his fingers moving without hesitation as he programmed the bacterial strain. The simulation ran smoothly. The modified bacteria devoured synthetic waste at a rate 100 times faster than before, breaking down the pollutants into harmless compounds. But that wasn't enough. The real challenge wasn't just cleaning the lake, it was sustaining the process indefinitely. Andy adjusted the sequencing again, integrating a regulatory mechanism into the bacteria's genetic code. A failsafe. If the pollution levels dropped below a certain threshold, the bacteria would enter a dormant state, preserving itself until contamination returned. That was the final piece of the puzzle. He sat back, exhaling slowly. The theory was solid. Now he needed proof. Standing up, he moved toward the laboratory's containment units, where organic samples from Vera 7 had been stored for study. He retrieved a vial of polluted lake water and carefully introduced a drop of his engineered bacteria. The reaction was immediate. The murky liquid began to clear, the bacteria working at a speed far beyond anything nature could achieve alone. His lips curled into a smirk. This was it. This was the solution. But a single test in a controlled environment wasn't enough. He needed real-world data. He needed to take this to the lake itself. And he needed to do it before anyone else realized what he was about to accomplish. And he stood at the edge of the polluted lake, the murky water stretching endlessly before him. The scent of decay clung to the humid air, thick with the remnants of industrial waste that had been dumped into the ecosystem for years. He crouched down, watching as a faint ripple disturbed the otherwise stagnant surface. Nothing lived here anymore. No fish, no plants, no microorganisms capable of sustaining life. It was a dead zone, suffocating under layers of toxins and chemical residue. He tightened his grip on the containment vial in his hand. Inside, his engineered bacteria swirled in a suspension, microscopic warriors ready to devour the pollution that had choked this place into silence. His heart pounded with anticipation. The laboratory tests had been promising, but this was the real challenge. The lake was massive, spanning kilometers in every direction. If his solution worked, it wouldn't just purify this body of water. It could prove that entire planets, ravaged by careless industrialization, could be restored. His fingers hovered over the vial's seal. Once he released the bacteria into the lake, there was no turning back. The regulatory mechanisms he had embedded into their genetic structure should keep them from spreading beyond control, but if he had miscalculated even slightly, he could trigger a new kind of ecological imbalance. His mind ran through the numbers one last time. Every calculation, every variable accounted for. It had to work. He twisted the cap and tipped the vial forward. A single drop of the liquid hit the water, vanishing into the dark depths. He watched, waiting. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the water directly beneath him began to shift. The toxins started breaking down, molecular structures collapsing as the bacteria multiplied, consuming pollutants at an exponential rate. Andy took a slow breath, stepping back as he observed the reaction unfold. The effect was subtle at first, but within minutes the change became undeniable. The murky sludge began to dissipate, as if something invisible was peeling away the layers of contamination. He could see further into the water, where the bacteria worked relentlessly, tearing apart synthetic compounds and reducing them into harmless organic matter. The transformation spread outward, radiating from the point where he had introduced the bacteria. His design was functioning exactly as intended. The microorganisms weren't just purifying the water, they were stabilizing it, restoring a chemical balance that could support life again. If the process continued at this rate, the entire lake would be clear in a matter of hours. He glanced up, scanning the horizon. The other students would be arriving soon, preparing to test their own filtration systems. None of them expected results this fast. He had a head start, and he intended to finish before anyone could interfere. He pulled a handheld scanner from his pocket and aimed it at the water, reading the toxin levels. The numbers were dropping faster than he had anticipated. His bacteria were not only surviving in the lake, they were thriving, adapting even better than he had programmed them to. His lips curled into a smirk. This was beyond success. This was revolutionary. But then an alert flashed across his screen. His brow furrowed as he read the warning. An abnormal surge in bacterial activity was spreading beyond the initial introduction point. His regulatory mechanisms were supposed to keep them contained to areas of high toxicity, but something was accelerating their reproduction. He turned his gaze back to the lake. The clear zone was expanding rapidly, faster than his models had predicted. The bacteria were no longer working at a controlled rate. They were multiplying at an exponential scale, moving deeper into the water, breaking down compounds faster than necessary. His jaw clenched. If they didn't slow down, they could destabilize the lake's entire ecosystem. Purifying the water was one thing, but if they stripped too much from it, minerals, essential organic compounds, he would be left with an entirely different kind of disaster. He swiped through his scanner, accessing the bacteria's genetic sequences in real time. He had programmed a failsafe, an embedded command that would put them into dormancy once pollution levels dropped below a certain threshold. But the bacteria weren't responding. The trigger wasn't activating. His mind raced through possibilities. The pollution itself had been mutating, adapting to resist natural degradation over the years. Had his bacteria adapted in turn, overriding the constraints he had placed on them? If so, he had created something even more powerful than he had realized. A deep sense of unease settled in his chest. He had to regain control before the situation escalated beyond his ability to contain it. He accessed his communicator, connecting directly to the university's secure lab servers. If he could modify the bacterial genome remotely, he might be able to force the dormancy command manually. But just as he initiated the override, an error message flashed across his screen. Connection denied. He stiffened. That shouldn't have happened. The university's systems were built to support live modifications to biological projects for safety reasons. Someone had cut off his access. His breath slowed as he realized what this meant. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone had already seen the results of his experiment and was trying to prevent him from interfering with it. His eyes darted toward the research outpost on the far side of the lake. The facility was equipped with its own monitoring systems. If the university's higher authorities had detected his experiment, they might have stepped in, either to observe or to manipulate the results. His fingers tightened around his scanner. He wasn't about to let this slip out of his control. Whatever was happening, he needed to fix it before the bacteria spread too far. The water before him was already clearing, its surface smooth and reflective. But beneath, something deeper was taking place. The bacteria weren't just reacting to the pollution. They were changing, and someone else knew exactly what was happening. Andy's fingers tightened around his scanner as his eyes flicked back to the lake. The water was nearly unrecognizable from before, crystal clear in some areas, yet unnaturally still, as if waiting for something to happen. His bacteria were supposed to slow their activity once the toxin levels dropped, but they weren't stopping. He had lost control of them, and now the entire ecosystem was at risk. His mind raced through solutions. He had designed a fail-safe, but if his remote override had been blocked, the only way to shut the bacteria down was through direct genetic manipulation. That meant he needed access to a secure lab. His best option was the research outpost on the far side of the lake. If someone at the university had restricted his access, he had to assume they were monitoring the experiment. Whether they were trying to sabotage him or simply study the results, he didn't know. What he did know was that he had no time to waste. He shoved his scanner into his pocket and took off toward the outpost. The ground beneath him was damp from the bacteria's rapid filtration. the once toxic sludge breaking down into clean, nutrient-rich soil. He could hear the faint hum of distant machinery, other students setting up their own filtration devices. None of them knew what was happening yet. He had to fix this before anyone else noticed. As he neared the facility, he spotted a figure standing near the entrance. Vayrix. The crystalline Zarkonian student had his arms crossed, his transparent form glowing faintly in the dim light. His violet eyes locked onto Andy with an expression that was impossible to read. Andy slowed his pace, but didn't stop. "You knew," he said, his voice low. "You saw the numbers." Vayrix didn't move. "I saw what you were doing," he said, his tone measured. "And I saw what the university did the moment it started working." Andy clenched his jaw. "Why did they cut my access?" Vayrix exhaled, the sound reverberating through his crystalline body. "Because you did something they didn't expect. Something they can't control." Andy took a step closer. "I didn't do this to prove a point. I did this to fix the lake. And now I need to shut it down before it spreads too far." Vayrix tilted his head. "Why would they let you?" The question stopped Andy cold. He had been so focused on regaining control that he hadn't considered the broader implications. If the university had restricted his access, it meant someone wanted to see how far the bacteria could go. They weren't shutting it down. They were letting it happen. Andy's pulse quickened. "You think they want to study it?" Vayrix nodded. "It's a biological purification system that outperforms every known filtration method. Of course they want to study it. But they don't care if it destabilizes the lake in the process." Andy turned toward the outpost, his mind sharpening with a new sense of urgency. If he didn't act now, the university would take control of his work and twist it into something else entirely. He had no intention of letting that happen. He reached the entrance, scanning his ID at the panel. Access denied. His fists clenched. Someone had already locked him out. Vayrix stepped up beside him. "They won't let you in." "But I can." Andy turned to him, suspicion creeping into his expression. "Why would you help me?" Vayrix's violet eyes glowed softly. "Because I don't trust them either." He reached out, his crystalline fingers pressing against the access panel. A faint pulse of energy radiated from his form, and the door slid open with a quiet hiss. Andy hesitated only for a second before stepping inside. The facility was dimly lit, filled with rows of terminals monitoring environmental data from the lake. Andy's eyes darted across the screens. The bacteria had already spread beyond the initial contamination zone. If he didn't shut them down soon, they would strip the water of essential minerals, leaving behind nothing but sterile liquid. He moved to the nearest terminal and began typing furiously, bypassing the security protocols blocking his access. Whoever had locked him out was good but not perfect. He had designed the bacteria. He knew their coding structure better than anyone. An alert flashed on the screen. Unauthorized override detected. Andy ignored it, his fingers flying across the interface as he searched for the genetic kill switch embedded in the bacteria's programming. Then, a voice echoed from behind him. "Step away from the terminal." Andy turned slowly. A man stood in the doorway, his uniform marked with the insignia of the university's biological research division. His gaze was cold, calculating. He wasn't a professor. He was an administrator. Someone with authority. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. Andy squared his shoulders. "I'm shutting it down." The man shook his head. "No, you're not." Vayrix stepped beside Andy, his crystalline form tensing. "You're letting it spread." The man's expression didn't change. "We're observing." Andy's hands clenched into fists. "It's going to destabilize the entire lake." The man tilted his head slightly. "We anticipated that. The ecosystem can be rebuilt. But what you've created? That's something we can't afford to destroy." And he felt a cold weight settle in his chest. This wasn't about fixing the lake anymore. This was about power. The university saw his bacteria as a resource, something they could control, experiment with, and ultimately claim as their own. His fingers twitched toward the terminal. He could still trigger the shutdown if he moved fast enough. The man's eyes darkened. "Don't," Andy moved. His hands flew over the keyboard, bypassing the last layer of security. Alarms blared through the facility. He hit the final command, forcing the bacteria into dormancy. The screens flickered, showing the bacteria's replication slowing, their metabolic processes grinding to a halt. The man exhaled sharply. "You don't understand what you've done." Andy turned to him, his expression hard. "I saved the lake, not your experiment." The man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The damage, or rather, the repair, was done. Vayrix placed a hand on Andy's shoulder. "We should go." Andy nodded. He had won, but he had also made an enemy, and something told him this wasn't over yet. Andy stepped out of the research outpost, his breath still unsteady as the alarms blared behind him. He had done it. The bacteria were shutting down, their replication processes grinding to a halt. The lake would stabilize. He had stopped the experiment before it spiraled beyond control. But as the adrenaline drained from his body, a new weight settled on his shoulders. Vayrix walked beside him, his crystalline form dimmed under the overcast sky. The Zarkonian's normally composed expression was clouded with something Andy had rarely seen from him: concern. Neither of them spoke as they moved toward the observation ridge overlooking the lake. From here, Andy could see the water shifting, the unnatural, rapid purification slowing as the bacteria entered dormancy. The process had worked. The lake wasn't just clean, it was alive again. The once murky surface reflected the light like a mirror, its depths no longer suffocated by sludge and synthetic waste. Andy watched as the first signs of natural recovery emerged, tiny aquatic organisms breaking through the surface, the return of an ecosystem that had once been declared unsalvageable. But his satisfaction was short-lived. He knew the university wouldn't let this go. He turned to Vayrix. "They're going to come after me for this." The Zarkonian didn't deny it. "You shut down something they saw as valuable. They won't forget that." Andy exhaled slowly, his mind already calculating his next steps. "I didn't do this for them. I did it because it was right." Vayrix's violet eyes locked onto his. "That doesn't mean they'll leave you alone." Andy knew that. He had embarrassed them. He had proven that nature, when given the right push, could surpass even the most advanced technological solutions. He had also exposed the university's willingness to let an ecosystem collapse just to study his creation. There was no way they would simply move on. A distant hum filled the air. Andy glanced toward the sky, where 3 sleek silver drones hovered just above the water's surface. They were scanning the lake, running deep environmental analyses, no doubt searching for any lingering traces of his bacteria. The university wasn't just observing anymore. They were documenting everything. He clenched his jaw. "They're going to try to replicate it." Vayrix followed his gaze. "If they can," Andy shook his head, "they'll find a way. They saw what it could do. Even if they have to start from scratch, they'll try to recreate it, maybe even weaponize it." He ran a hand through his hair. "I can't stop them from digging through my research, but I can make sure they don't get the final piece." Vayrix tilted his head slightly. "The bacteria are already in dormancy. What more can you do?" Andy pulled out his scanner, fingers tapping quickly against the interface. "I built a failsafe, a true failsafe." He worked through the genetic code he had written, his mind moving faster than his hands. "I couldn't completely erase them before, but now that they're dormant, I can trigger a self-deletion sequence. Every bacterium will break itself down at the molecular level, leaving nothing behind." Vayrix studied him for a long moment. "Once you do this, it's gone forever. Your work, your discovery, everything." Andy nodded. "That's the point. If I don't do this, they'll turn it into something else. This wasn't meant to be controlled. Varix didn't argue. He simply stepped back, letting Andy make the decision. Andy took one last look at the lake, at the clean, glistening surface that hadn't existed just a day ago. This was what mattered. Not the bacteria, not the recognition, not the competition between him and the rest of the class. The only thing that mattered was that the lake would live. His fingers hovered over the final command. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed it. The scanner blinked, sending the genetic sequence directly into the bacteria's core programming. A chain reaction triggered instantly. Across the lake, at a microscopic level, the bacteria began breaking themselves apart, dissolving into harmless organic compounds. There would be no evidence of their existence, no samples for the university to collect, no blueprints for them to replicate. The drones overhead flickered, their scanners struggling to detect what was no longer there. The university had lost its leverage. Andy exhaled, feeling the weight in his chest finally lift. It was done. The lake was clean, and no one could use his work for their own agenda. He had won, not by proving himself to the university, but by ensuring that something pure remained untouched by greed. Varix gave a slow nod. You made the right choice. Andy watched the water one last time before turning away. Let's get out of here. As they walked back toward the main facility, Andy knew this wasn't the last time he would clash with the university. He had made enemies today, but he had also proven something far more important. That sometimes the best solutions weren't the most powerful, the most complex, or the most controlled. Sometimes the best solutions were the ones that simply let nature heal itself. And no one, not the university, not the researchers, not the administrators, could take that away from him.